On the outside, it seemed she had it all. She was born into a noble family and was famous for her beauty and later for her piety. God showered her with graces, visions, and miracles. But those whom he raises, he also humbles. And no one knew that Jesus had picked his little rose for him alone, and therefore must be stripped clean. Rose was born April 20th, 1586. She had a sweet disposition, and legend says that she caused her mother no pain in childbirth. However, Rose would make up for this later on, because although she was her mother's favorite, she was also the child who caused her the most pain. Before she was Rose, she was first Isabel, named after her grandmother who lived with the family. But a miraculous vision made her mother, Olivia, change her name to Rose, much to Rose's grandmother's great dismay. Because of the baby's unusual beauty, the servant girl, Mariana, used to call little Isabel her little rosebud, because the coloring of her rosy lips and cheeks reminded her of a rose. One day, as she checked on the baby, who was lying in her cradle, she was amazed to see that the baby's face had transformed into a rose. Her cry had everyone running to see what was the matter, and Olivia, instead of seeing a rose on the baby's face, saw a beautiful rose floating above the baby's cradle. From that moment on, Olivia announced that the baby would no longer be called Isabel, but Rose. When Grandmother Isabel heard this, she was upset. She had not seen the miracle and therefore didn't believe it. She insisted that the baby was baptized Isabel, and therefore she should be called Isabel. However, her daughter was equally stubborn and insisted that the baby would be called Rose. Neither woman would give in, and so Rose, or Isabel, would answer to her two names until she was confirmed. Even as a little girl of 3, Rose was naturally pious and obedient. Her mother and grandmother's jealous feud over her name, however, caused Rose a lot of confusion and pain. When her grandmother would instruct her to do something using the name Isabel, Olivia would often intervene and tell Rose to do something else. If Rose was obedient to her mother would be upset. And if she was obedient to her grandmother would be equally upset. So no matter how obedient Rose was, she was always in trouble with someone. Thankfully, God gave Rose a happy and cheerful disposition. She spent much of her time praying and thinking of the passion of Jesus. One time, she hurt her thumb when a heavy pot fell on it, and the nail had to be removed. She bore this pain bravely, and the doctor could not believe the courage of one so young. When Olivia asked her later if her thumb was hurting her, Rose would point to a picture of Jesus and say, "That crown hurt him more." Already, she was measuring her pain next to his. Olivia wanted Rose to learn to read and write so that she could read some of the saint books on her own. She saw that Rose was already showing a great interest in St. Catherine of Siena. However, Rose was still only 3 years old. Gaspar, her husband, dared to argue with her, saying that Rose was too young to read and write. But Olivia insisted and taught Rose her letters, showing her how to write them, and then have Rose copy them. But Rose's young age hampered her writing and learning, and whenever she showed her work to her mother, Olivia would scold her for not doing it right. Eventually, Olivia had enough and sent Rose away to her room. 15 minutes later, Rose came back to show her mother her work. She had copied down the letters perfectly. Then she read a paragraph from the Saint Book of St. Catherine of Siena. Her mother was astounded and asked her how this could be. "I prayed to the baby Jesus," Rose explained, "and he taught me how to read and write." Olivia herself testified to this story during the investigation of Rose's canonization. Legend says that when Rose was 3 years old, while in prayer, her face took on a supernatural shine that worried her mother so much that she sent for the doctor. As unusual as these things were, Olivia would soon get used to them as they increased throughout Rose's life. She would get used to them, but never understand them. Although Rose didn't play much with the other children, taking no interest in games, she formed a friendship with a neighbor boy the entire family learned to love. This little boy loved Jesus as much as Rose did, and throughout her life she would go to him for his support and friendship. This little boy's name was StMartindePorres. When Rose was 5 years old, she made her first confession. Her confessor knew that although Rose was very young, there was something extraordinary about her spirituality that set her apart from the other children. And for this reason, once he felt she truly understood her commitment, and after much prayer and discernment, he allowed her to make the vow of virginity. But he told her not to tell her parents of this vow, as they would not understand. Inspired by her vow of virginity and her role model, St. Catherine of Siena, she decided to cut her hair short. In her storybook, she read that a priest had advised Catherine to cut her hair to discourage anyone from wanting to marry her. Although she was still only 5 years old, her mother was already starting to prepare her for marriage. Rose secretly showed her brother, Fernando, her favorite brother, what she had done. Taking off her veil, she showed that she had cut her hair except for her bangs. She said, "I left this part long so that when I wear my veil, no one will notice that my hair is cut. As so many girls go to hell on account of their vanity over their pretty hair, I've decided to keep mine short. Now I look ugly and no one will want to marry me." Fernando had howled with laughter, but when Olivia found out later what Rose had done, she punished Rose severely. No doubt she began to regret encouraging Rose to read. As Rose's love for God grew, her desire to live only for Him became more intense. With the permission of her parents, she and her brother Fernando made a little hut for Rose to pray in, made out of sticks, mud, and leaves. She would spend most of her time in this little hermitage, much to the frustration of Olivia, who wanted Rose to show more of an interest in things girls her age liked. Out of all the girls in the house, Rose was the prettiest, and so Olivia focused her attention on Rose. Since Rose showed no interest in her appearance and was so resistant to dressing up for fiestas, Olivia pushed all the harder. While her sisters wore hand-me-down dresses from Olivia's wardrobe, she spent hard-earned money on buying new fabric for dresses for Rose. All the girls had to wear wreaths of flowers, but Rose was forced to wear roses as a nod to her name. Being singled out like this made it all the harder for Rose to wear the dresses. She didn't like the attention and she hated the compliments. In her great awareness of how easy it is to become proud and vain, Rose was constantly on guard for any weakening on her part to vanity. Then one day, Rose's fussing abruptly stopped. No one knew when this happened, but as the crown of roses was placed on Rose's head, a needle used to secure the crown pierced her scalp. She didn't utter a word and no one knew about it. Rose found a way to practice penance at the same time while she was receiving praise and compliments. As for Olivia, she knew nothing about this or she would have forbidden it. She thought she had finally won over Rose and considered her silence a victory. At 7 years old, in her desire to imitate St. Catherine the best she could, Rose began to fast by giving up first desserts and then later permanently gave up meat. In addition to this, she also refrained from drinking water for as long as she could, but as usual, her mother didn't know about this. In fact, Rose most likely came up with the idea when her mother made her practice obedience by first asking for a drink of water. Sometimes to have her practice self-denial, she would purposely make Rose wait to drink water, not knowing that Rose had already gone without water up to 2 or 3 days before asking for it. Also under the inspiration of St. Catherine, Rose began to receive communion up to 4 times a week, and soon daily. She had made her first communion much earlier than the typical age, although no one knows exactly what age she was. Due to her deep spirituality, her confessor allowed this. Olivia and her mother had an embroidery business, and Rose, along with her sisters, were taught how to embroider to help with the business. Rose especially had a talent for needlework, and later she would use the money she earned for the poor. She also showed a talent for gardening. Her father had suggested that since she had such a love for the poor, that she should grow herbs to use as medicine for the sick. Rose loved this idea, and under the guidance of her friend StMartindePorres, she learned what herbs to use for medicine. Rose had a deep desire to practice penance. She wanted to be able to rise during the night to pray, but she couldn't do this without waking her sisters. She also wanted to make her bed more uncomfortable, but again, she couldn't do this since her sisters shared a bed with her, and so she asked permission to have her own room. When asked why, she only said, "So that I can be alone." Her parents saw this as selfishness and scolded her, saying, "Who are you that your sisters are unworthy to share a room with you?" Rose had already received permission from her confessor to practice these penances, but without her own room, this was impossible. It wasn't until a year later that this wish was finally granted, only because Olivia thought Rose's desire for her own space was a sign that she was finally taking an interest in personal adornment. Not wanting to miss this opportunity, she and Gaspar found space near the house to make a little room for Rose made of clay bricks. To Olivia's delight, Rose asked for a bed with curtains on them. This was the norm at the time for privacy and warmth. However, Rose wanted the curtains for only one reason: to hide the logs that she placed in the bed. She had the permission from her confessor to do this, but knew that it would only cause anxiety for her mother. Besides, St. Catherine had slept on boards and didn't tell her mother, so Rose felt that she was doing nothing wrong. When Rose was around 10 or 11 years old, her family moved temporarily to Kyiv, due to her father being relocated for work because of financial hardship. As they had at one time been wealthy, now they were poor, and Rose continued to help support her family with her needlework and flower cultivation, selling them at the local market. Other than this, Rose was very secluded in Kyiv, staying close to home in work and prayer. It wasn't safe in this new area, as there was a lot of crime. During this time, two things happened that would change Rose's life forever. Her favorite sister, Mercedes, who had always been rather sickly, died, and later, Rose was confirmed. Mercedes' death caused the entire family much grief, but especially for Rose, who had been close to her sister. Being near death, Mercedes' faith had deepened, and Rose found in her not only a sister, but a spiritual companion. Shortly after Mercedes' death, a new trial commenced. Rose developed a mysterious illness that affected her hands and legs that eventually turned into paralysis. With Mercedes' death so fresh, the anxiety that Rose was also dying was high. Rose was not allowed to have her own bedroom in Kyiv because before leaving Lima, Olivia had discovered the logs in Rose's bed. It didn't matter that Rose's confessor allowed it. She was angry and hurt that Rose deliberately kept it a secret. And so Rose shared a room with her sisters, where Olivia could keep a close eye on her. She had heard from Summer that raw animal hides could cure paralysis. So in an attempt to cure her, she wrapped an uncured animal's hide around Rose's legs and arms. The raw hide came from Fernando's pet llama, whom he loved dearly, but was willing to sacrifice it if it meant Rose's cure. When Rose learned of this, she was devastated and protested, but Olivia told her that Fernando loved Rose more. After tying the hide to Rose's arms and legs and one on her back, she instructed the ever-obedient Rose to not remove them so that they could do their work. Unfortunately, Olivia had forgotten about the hides and left them on too long, and Rose's skin was covered with rashes and ulcers. Besides this, pieces of Rose's flesh came off with it, causing Olivia to shriek. But Rose had not removed it despite the pain that it caused. Rose's cure finally came about after she prayed to be cured, after she learned that the Archbishop would be in town to administer the sacrament of confirmation. Besides this miracle, it was the Archbishop who settled the conflict over Rose's name. After laying his hands on her head and making the sign of the cross on her forehead, it was time to call her by name. But what name to choose? He had heard long ago about the baby whose face had turned into a rose and the family feud over what to call her. After a prayer to the Holy Spirit, however, the name that he called her by was Rose. At first, her grandmother was a little taken aback, but then she shrugged and said, "Well, after all, since the Archbishop called her Rose, I suppose it is right. I've always thought that it suited her. I just wanted to do the correct thing before God and His church." And so this settled the matter of her name once and for all. Rose was especially happy to have the matter settled, as she loved the name Rose. But during this time of her life, she suffered from scruples, and she worried that the love for her name stemmed from vanity. While praying about this one day, the statue of Our Lady and Jesus came alive, Our Lady smiled at Rose and said, "This divine infant approves of the name of Rose, but he wishes you to add to this name of his mother. From now on, you will be known as Rosa de Santa Maria." At 14 years old, Rosa's family moved back to Lima. There she again resumed her work with the sick and the poor, tending to her garden, and happy to be back in her little hermitage. She was also happy to visit her friend Martin. He had finished his apprenticeship and begun the work of medicine and barbering. He was happy to teach Rose all he knew so that she could continue her work with the sick and the poor. Now that her grandmother was slowing down in age, Olivia began to rely more on Rose for her help in the kitchen, watching her little brothers and sisters, and helping with the embroidery business. Rose was happy to help, but she didn't know that Olivia had secrets of her own, and that her true motive was to prepare Rose to be a wife and mother. Rose was 14 now, and her beauty drew more attention than ever. Olivia was sure that if Rose was more sociable, she would have a suitor in no time. But every time Olivia threw a party, Rose found an excuse not to attend. Since pleading with her mother didn't work, she would pray for a way out, and many times these prayers were answered. Sometimes Rose would get a fever at the very last minute, and other times someone would send for Rose to help a sick person right before the party started. The few times her prayers weren't answered, Rose would find a way out on her own. One time, she rubbed a chemical in her eyes, causing them to become red and swollen. Olivia's answer to this problem was to take a stick to Rose and give her a severe beating. Another time, Rose purposely stepped on a hot coal, burning her foot. When Olivia found out that Rose had done this on purpose, she gave her another beating. On top of this, Olivia also found out that Rose had been piercing her scalp with not just one pin, but two. All of this put a lot of tension in their relationship, and Olivia found herself constantly angry with Rose. To make peace with her mother, Rose asked permission to wear a penitential band under the wreath of roses instead of the pins. After hearing Rose's reasons, she agreed that it would be fine, as long as her confessor agreed and as long as she continued to wear the crown of roses over the band. Unfortunately, another misunderstanding came about. When Gaspar swung at one of his boys one day when they disobeyed him, Rose stepped in front of her brother to protect him, and she got hit instead. Trickles of blood ran down her face, and Olivia grabbed the band off Rose's head to look at it. Inside the band, it showed 3 spikes that had not been filed down, as they should have been. She angrily approached Rose's confessor about this, asking why he would allow her to wear the band with spikes. Her confessor, too, was flabbergasted and thought that Rose had filed the points flat, so he filed it flat himself, and Rose wore the band for the rest of her life. As Rose neared adulthood, the Archbishop paid a special visit to Rose and her parents, and asked them if Rose ever considered entering the religious life, particularly the Poor Clares. Rose instantly perked up, but her parents turned the Archbishop down flat, saying that they needed her at home for her help with the embroidery business. Besides, they wanted her to marry, as that would help the family, especially if she married someone with money. Confused, Rose put the matter into God's hands, and later decided that she would do whatever her spiritual director advised. After talking it over, the priest told her that God wanted her for the religious life and that she should enter the cloister. However, instead of the Poor Clares, he advised she join the Dominicans, as they would dispense of her dowry. But he cautioned her not to tell her mother, but only her grandmother. Then she must sneak out of the house to enter the cloister. Only Rose's grandmother and brother knew of this. The morning she was to enter, she asked Fernando, who was escorting her, to let her stop at the shrine of Our Lady of the Rosary one last time, one of her favorite places to pray. Fernando agreed, but after waiting for a while, he grew impatient and told Rose that they needed to get going. Rose answered from her kneeling position, "I should certainly like to leave, Fernando, but I cannot move." "What do you mean you cannot move?" Fernando huffed. He grabbed her under the arms and tried to lift her, but found that it was impossible. It was as though Rose was glued to the ground. Finally, he said out of frustration, "If God is doing this, find out why." So Rose prayed, "Good Mother, if you deliver me, I promise to go back to my mother and live at home with my parents for as long as you order me to, instead of the convent." Instantly, she was able to move. "You and your miracles," Fernando exclaimed. And so Rose did not enter the convent that morning, and they made it back before Isabel broke the news to Olivia. Later, Rose told her mother what she almost did, and Olivia was more hurt than angry, but she was comforted to know that Our Lady was on her side. But now what was Rose to do with her life? What was God calling her to? She had been certain with her vow of virginity that she would eventually enter the religious life, but apparently God wanted her to be at home with her parents. One day, as Rose prayed for God's will for her, a black and white butterfly landed over her heart, leaving a black and white mark. Her mother was not happy with the insect leaving a mark, but Rose explained, "It means that God wants me to become a Dominican tertiary. I was just praying that He would make known His divine will for me when this butterfly came. As it rested on me, I had an interior light explaining what it meant." But Olivia didn't believe it and said it was the work of the devil. She ordered Rose to go change her gown. After a few weeks of Rose's pleas and prayers, her mother finally gave in and gave Rose permission to enter the Third Order. Olivia did eventually accept Rose's entrance, although grudgingly, but it took a miracle. After the ceremony, she was exhausted and needed to lay down, and she saw in a vision Mary and Jesus, who was holding a rose. Our Lady said to Olivia, "This rose represents your daughter, my son's cherished flower. I plucked her for him from your garden, and he will not let her go. Only see how grateful he is to you for having tended her for him and for having given her to me." Shortly after entering the Third Order, Rose began to have visions of hell. These visions were inspired by the devil, most of them being her rejected by God. Many times her family would find her frozen with a look of terror on her face. Nothing they did would snap her out of it. Her mother thought they were epilepsy fits. One day, after waiting for Rose to come with her for an errand, Olivia sent one of Rose's brothers to check on her. He came back and reported, "She's having one of those fits. She keeps staring at her flowers as though she saw the devil himself and has her knife out ready to cut the flower. We tried to take the knife from her, but she's too strong. Her grip is like a man's." Rose was sent to a priest to help her, only to be sent to another, and so on. As if being tormented by visions of hell wasn't enough, she also had to suffer constantly from being misunderstood. She was told by these priests that the visions were simply a result of deprived sleep and poor diet, while other priests told her that it was the vapors. This and the miracles that seemed to happen at her hand gave her the unwanted attention of admirers and the suspicion of her family. And at the end of each day, she would have to go to sleep, where she would have nightmares of hell. If she tried to stay awake and pray, she would see hell in visions. It isn't said how long Rose had to suffer like this, but she finally found relief in her good friend, StMartindePorres, who by now was a Dominican brother. In addition to her frightful visions, she also suffered from spiritual aridity. She, who could always sense God's presence when she prayed, now could not sense Him at all. In some ways, this was worse than the visions of hell. She persevered and came up with a way to always keep Him in her thoughts, by calling Him by every name in the Bible with every stitch of her embroidery. Because of Rose's fasting and her severe penances, she developed arthritis in her back and knees. At the same time, she also developed asthma due to the damp climate and constantly being outside in her garden. This meant when she had asthma, she had to sit down, but her arthritis would prevent this. When she tried to lay down to relieve the arthritis, her asthma wouldn't allow her to breathe. Still, with all these trials, she didn't allow them to hold her back. Not only did she continue to administer to the sick, she decided to build a little infirmary in the back of her hut so that she could tend to her sick more efficiently, both day and night. So her days were full of work, and her nights full of prayer and visions of hell. On the outside, it seemed that Rose was always content. No one but her closest friends and the members of the Third Order knew what was going on inside of her. But God allowed His little Rose to be tested further. A new neighbor had moved into town, and on hearing about the woman with incredible beauty, the neighbor, who was a young man near Rose's age, took a romantic interest in her. His hope was to court her and eventually marry her. Rose's parents, of course, were only too happy to help urge Rose in this direction, as Rose was still free to marry, so they could not understand why Rose still resisted. Rose genuinely liked this man, whose name was Vincent, and she didn't want to hurt him, so she told him of her vow of virginity. He was disappointed, of course, but took the blow well, and decided that it was better to be her friend than nothing at all. And so they spent a lot of time together. Rose taught him how to pray and began to give him spiritual direction. On the other side of things, word spread that Rose had a suitor, and this reached the ears of her confessor, who knew of her vow of virginity. Not only that, but most of the priests and brothers in the Dominican monastery also knew of her vow of virginity. And so as they heard that Vincent was calling on Rose, Rose's confessor cut her off for spiritual direction without asking for an explanation. This was a blow for Rose, who depended on his direction as she continued to experience aridity and the visions of hell, and yet she had no idea what she did to deserve his anger. Rose's parents, who were hopeful of the growing relationship between the two, still didn't know of Rose's vow that she had made at the age of 5, and asked Vincent why he didn't ask Rose to marry him. After all, he had their blessing. Vincent admitted that he would be the happiest man in the world if Rose agreed to be his wife, but he respected her vow of virginity. Gaspar, who managed to keep his composure until Vincent left, blew his lid. He ranted and raved at Rose, and Olivia, who now knew what was going on, added her screeches to his yells. Then her siblings found out, and they too went after Rose in anger. As a punishment for this, her parents refused to escort Rose to daily mass or adoration anymore. She could go once a week on Sundays like the rest of them. When the other tertiaries began to notice Rose's absence at mass and daily prayer, she was scolded by one of them. Rose did not tell her of all that happened, but only said that she was unable to go to daily mass by her own accord. However, God made up for this by letting Rose go to adoration and mass by bilocation, not just one church, but sometimes 3 in one day. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to convince the fellow tertiaries, and Rose was soon investigated. They arrived at the home as Olivia was hosting some prominent people, and when she heard of the reason of the visit, she was humiliated. The investigation went on for an entire week, and although Rose was cleared in the end, the family could not get over the humiliation. With Rose never marrying and seeming to be influenced by the devil, the family treated her coldly and with suspicion. Some family friends, called the Matzas, witnessed the tension and volunteered for Rose to come and live with them. Rose's family did not fight for her to stay with them since she would still be able to do her sewing and give them the profits. This would be Rose's final home. Rose spent the final years of her life with the Matzas. They were a wonderful family that treated Rose with respect and love. They were very well off and even had their own chapel, which Rose spent most of her time. But all of this didn't come without suffering. In fact, it would be Rose's final stripping. Although it had seemed that once more Rose had it all, she in fact had nothing. She no longer had her little hermitage or her garden of herbs and flowers. She no longer could see her spiritual director or her friend Brother Martin. She no longer could visit the shrine of Our Lady of the Rosary, and she no longer had her work with the poor and the sick. But she used her time to serve the Matza family the best she could, who allowed her to pray as long as she wanted to in the chapel, even up to the point where she didn't come out for 2 days sometimes. They too experienced some of her miracles without making her feel like she was possessed by the devil or revered as a saint. Rose hit the epitome of her union with God when she had a mystical marriage with Jesus. After this, she had a vision where Jesus told her that she would die and how. Rose took this news with joy and spent the last 4 months of her life visiting with family and friends and preparing for the end. Only one thing bothered her about all of this, and that was that part of her suffering would be to experience a terrible thirst. So great was her anxiety that she begged the household to give her water in her last moments when she asked for it. But when that time came, Rose suffered from a high fever, her body racked in pain as though it were on fire. The doctor forbade anyone to give Rose any water for fear she would choke on it. Instead, he told them to give her a thick, syrupy drink. This only made her even more thirsty. Rose cried out, "I thirst," and then realized what God was asking of her. All her life, she always said yes to all of her sufferings, and she said yes now. Her family had all come to gather around her bed, showing remorse and confusion for how they had treated her. Rose knew interiorly that her father would die soon after her death, and not too long afterward, her brother Fernando and his wife would die. Her brothers and sisters were now all married, and so her mother would be alone. Rose then begged God to spare Olivia her grief and not be broken by sorrow. After going into ecstasy a final time, Rose died. While everyone sat by Rose's body in grief, Olivia left the room, but not to cry. Her heart had been filled with a supernatural joy.